One of my favorite things about Jesus is his humanity. Now, I believe Jesus is fully God, fully divine, right? He is fully God, but he's also fully man. One of my favorite theological terms is the hypostatic union of Christ. That's a really fancy term, but it just means that Jesus is fully God and fully man. He's got these two natures, and they don't diminish each other. They're able to live in harmony in Christ. So it's a really cool term, and when we understand it, we can get all sorts of comfort from that. And sometimes I forget that Jesus is and was fully human, though. Even with all of that, even with all of my reading in the Bible and all of my studies, sometimes I forget that Jesus is fully man. And I've talked about this multiple times, I feel like at least, because I keep forgetting somehow. Now I think about it, and a lot of times when I think about it, I get this idea in my head that, well, WWJD, right? Jesus is fully man, so what would Jesus do? And I started to think about how he would have hope, and he would have faith, and he would trust, and all those things are true. But he's also fully human. And it's fully human to feel all sorts of emotions. A great verse is from Hebrews 4:15, and it says that we have a high priest who can empathize with our weakness. We have a high priest who understands how we're feeling, right? So it brings up this question. Like, what does it mean that Jesus can fully understand my emotions? Can he understand my pain? Can he understand my suffering? Can he understand my heartache? Can he understand my confusion? If he's fully human, can he understand these things? Really, we just have to read the Gospels to find the answers. Because the Gospels are the accounts of Jesus being on earth, right? That's where we get that information. The rest of the New Testament is talking about kind of like the implications of everything that happened in the Gospels. But in the Gospels, we get this picture of what it meant for Jesus to be fully human. And that's comforting. And it should be. Now, I'm going to warn you that this may not be for the faint of heart, because some people might not like what I'm about to say, but it's still right there in the Bible, in the Gospels. And I think we should always study the Gospels. We should always be looking at that, because we're always going to see more of Christ. We're going to see more of who he is. And the more we see of him, the closer we grow to him, and the more we understand him, we move from glory to glory, as 2 Corinthians says. We start to move into newness and into new life and into new things when we understand who this Jesus is. When we understand that he is fully God, but he's also fully human. So I was thinking this morning, what are some things that it means for Jesus to be fully human? So this first one, I just think is kind of funny, is Jesus called his friends foolish and dull. Foolish and dull. Right, so in Matthew 15:16 is where he says this, but before this, he's telling the disciples a parable, and they're just not getting it. And so he looks at Peter and he's like, are you still so dull? Now, what's interesting is there's a Greek word which I can't pronounce, but it's a pretty cool word because it means without understanding, foolish, and stupid. So Jesus looks at his friend, his disciple, this one who's following him, and he's like, seriously, are you still not getting this? That's comforting to me, because I feel like sometimes I even say to myself, how are you not getting this? Sometimes I feel like Jesus is saying to me, how do you not get this? That's comforting. But we also know Jesus would flip tables, make whips, and drive people out, right? And we laugh about that, but why was he doing that? Because he was mad. He was upset that people were defiling God's house, the area that was meant for all the peoples to come in, and the area that was the Gentile court where people could come in and seek after God. They weren't allowed to get in there, and God was not going to have that. Jesus wasn't going to have that, so he got angry and drove the people out. Jesus also asked the Father for another way. When we read the story about the garden, sometimes I'm afraid it's too easy to overlook what happens in the middle there. We go straight to the end where Jesus says, not my will, but your will be done. And that's the place that we should get to. But before we get there, is Jesus saying, Father, if there's another way, let this cup pass from me. And he sweats blood and he's crying. That's a fully human emotion. Jesus laid it out before the Father. He's like, if there's any other way to do this, please. Yes, he submits, but his humanity is expressed there in the fact that he cries out to God and wants another way if possible. That's comforting. Another thing Jesus would do and did do is his job. Now, we could argue and say this actually should have gone before the last one, because in Luke 9:51, Jesus knows that it's time for his ascension to come. But that means before his ascension must be the crucifixion. And he sets his face towards Jerusalem. What does it mean to be fully human? To do your job. Yeah, that's a hard one for some people, but Jesus did his job. He knew what was coming, and he put his face towards Jerusalem and said, I'm going to go do what I have to do. I'm going to do what I came here to do. I'm going to complete my mission. I'm going to do my job. That's something it means for Jesus to be fully human. If we're asking the question, WWJD, what would Jesus do? He'd do his job. That's comforting and not at the same time. Another one is Jesus would and did weep. One of any Sunday school kid's favorite Bible verse to memorize is John 11:35. Jesus wept. They get their little piece of candy or token or whatever they get, right? But they like this verse because they can memorize it. Jesus wept. Now, we could go into really what that means, and there's a lot that can and has been said about that. But one thing we can just take away from that is Jesus cried. He looked around him and saw the brokenness. He saw death. He saw pain, and he wept. And I think it was Charles Spurgeon who said, a God who never weeps can never wipe away my tears. And I think that's beautiful. Knowing that God in Christ is so fully human that he experienced the emotion of crying because of the pain should give us comfort. That when we go to God in prayer and when we come before him in his holy throne room, that we can cry. Jesus knows what it means to cry. He knows what it means to weep. He knows what it means to feel pain. And that brings me to my next point, is that Jesus knows what it's like to feel alone. Think about that for a second. Jesus knows what it feels like to be alone. Now, we could look and you might want to look and we could say the disciples, how they all abandoned him and they left him alone, right? And Jesus knew that and it was coming and everything else. But instead, I'd rather look to the cross. Matthew 27:46. Jesus does not say, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's not what he says. That is what he cries out in a loud voice. Jesus, hanging, beaten, bleeding, dying on a cross, does not say, my God, why have you forsaken me? No, he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? He cries out in pain, feeling alone and abandoned. That is a God that we have. That is the Jesus that we love, is one who can cry out in pain. So that when we cry out in pain, and I don't care how tough you are, I don't care how strong you are, I don't care what a great fake face you can put on, we all feel alone sometimes. We all feel pain and abandonment. We all feel confusion. We all feel lost. We all feel alone. And Jesus says, I get that feeling. I know what that's like. You're not alone, but I know how you feel. So let it out. You know, we could go on and on. The point is, when we read the Gospels, we see that Jesus expressed the full range of human emotions. He laughed, he cried, he was hungry, he wept, he was tempted, he felt alone, he felt abandoned, he got upset, not sinfully, but he got angry and drove people out of his Father's house. Could be inferring, but I think he got annoyed with his friends sometimes. Like, Jesus expressed all of these emotions. And yes, he hoped and he trusted and he had faith in God. But faith in God does not remove the truth of emotions and feelings. Faith in God does not neglect the fact that we live in uncertain and confusing times. Faith and hope and trust in God doesn't mean that you can't also go, I feel so alone. Or I'm so brokenhearted over the loss of this. Or I just don't know what to do. Or I got to go do my job. And it's going to be hard. Right? Jesus understands all of that. That is the high priest we have. That is the comforter that we have. Is one who understands fully what it means to feel those feelings so he can empathize with our weakness. So back to the original question, WWJD, what would Jesus do? Whatever situation you're going through right now, what would Jesus do? Well, read the Gospels and you'll find out. One thing I know for certain that Jesus would do, because he did it throughout the Gospels, read the 4 of them, you will see him doing this throughout the Gospels, is he would hope and he would trust and he would have faith and he would be honest about his emotions. He would be real with the Father. So I wouldn't say, don't go to Jesus and try to see what he has for you. Run to him. Cling to him with everything you have and say, I don't understand, or give me strength, or help me through this, or hold me. I would say, don't go to God and say, God, I'm confused. Go to God and cry out from the depths of your being, I'm confused, I'm scared, I'm hurt, I'm sad. Bring it before him in honesty and in truth, and you will experience an intimacy you did not know was possible. You would feel comfort afterwards you did not know was there. You would experience God in a whole new way if you lived like Jesus did. If when you asked the question, what would Jesus do, you responded the way he would. Faith, hope, trust, love, and honesty about your emotions. That's the God we have. That's the humanity of Jesus, is a God who says, you can never understand me, so I'll make myself relatable to you. That's what we have. That's what we need to embrace. It's just a thought.